As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. If you're writing about a medical drama or other high-intensity journey involving another person, how do you write about these events without swallowing your story of transformation? What would you do if your agent's feedback to you was more chicken? That's exactly what Kristin Jarvis Adams' agent said to her after reading a draft of her memoir, The Chicken Who Saved Us. Join us as we explore the challenges of turning an animal into a primary character in your memoir, learning to appreciate the diverse ways we communicate, how to get past your vendetta mindset, and the power of finding the pinpoints of light in dark times on this week's episode of the Writing Your Resilience podcast. Let's dive in. Well, hello, Kristin. I am so glad to have you on the Writing Your Resilience podcast. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
When I read the title of your book, I knew I had to read it, and there was so much I wanted to know. So I'm going to hold this up for everyone who is watching on YouTube. But here's your title, The Chicken Who Saved Us, The Remarkable Story of Andrew and Frightful. We are going to dive deeply into this book. But before we get started, I always like to ask the author, what would you like us to know about the story?
Yes, I would say that just even the act of writing the story was born out of this deep need to make sense of my life. There were so many things coming at me from all different directions. And, just that need to quiet your mind and kind of find the peace within. And I had to get it out. So it was very therapeutic. Just the process of writing it, trying to think about it and look at it from a different angle than this terrified mom who was experiencing these traumas after traumas.
Yeah. And as I was reading your book and spending time with my body, I could feel that sense of exhaustion. There is a relentlessness to the journey. I was just reading going, oh my goodness, again. And I'm not going to get into too much of the agains because I want people to read your book, but I definitely felt this heaviness inside me. And yet you wrote this book in a way that isn't heavy, right? So there is a heaviness to the story, but then there's also this lightness. So I want to start with the chickens because people are probably like, what? And I did not know that I would be reading a book one day where I would care so much about a chicken. But I do. What's interesting is, when I'm reading a book, I always read forewords, introductions, and acknowledgments. I read through the whole book. And in your acknowledgments, you put down that your agent said, more chicken. I 100% agree with him. I think that was the best choice you could have made. But for anyone who's listening and they're like, what are you talking about with this chicken? First, can you explain who Frightful is? And then I want to talk about how did you go about writing about a chicken in a way that made me care about him?
That's a great question. When I initially was trying to envision the hook for this book, the heart of this book was, at first I was thinking this is going to be a mom's journey and a brother and a sister and a family and talking about what happened there. And I realized that more of the story was about me trying to understand the language of my son. Yeah. And my son has autism. And as you find in the book, there's a whole bunch of other contributing factors to the complex things that happened over the years. There was just this sweetness and this incredible relationship between this boy and this bird. When I pitched the book, I had pitched it to some agents and editors, and my line was, my son's best friend is a chicken named Frightful. Everybody kind of stopped because it's such an unusual thing and asked me about it. Even as I was pitching and talking to other people, I realized the core of my book is this relationship between this young autistic boy who at the time didn't speak at all and this bird. They developed this conversation in this language. And so throughout the book, I was exploring, how do I step into and understand this language between these two creatures?
Yeah.
And after I had sold the book and sent my manuscript in, I had my manuscript review from the editor. She had a few pages of things, move this around, try this, try that. At the very bottom, she said, more chicken. It just like opened up this whole new level of understanding. And this has become a household word at home. More chicken really has come to mean get to the heart of the story. Where is that nugget, that universal feeling that everyone feels? It doesn't have to be a chicken. It could be a dog. It could be another person. And so in redoing an entirely new draft, I brought this chicken to life in a very unusual way.
Yeah. And what I love about it is that it's not hokey.
That was something that I had to really work with, was how do I get more chicken in there and not be it like bok, bok, cluck, cluck for the chicken. I was with some writer friends one evening and doing some of our writing together. And one of the gals just said, hey, what if you made the chicken talk? And my first thought is, what memoir is ever written with a talking animal? My brain is going to, kids' picture books. And she said, just think about it. I had our chicken coop in the backyard. I took my iPad out there and recorded the sounds of the hens and just sat out there really for days, off and on for a few weeks, listening to the chickens talk. And chickens have a whole wide variety of language, and it's quite sophisticated. And so I went back and I was looking at some videos that we had taken of my son when he was out with the chickens or sitting on the front porch talking to them. And I could kind of pick up on this sing-song back and forth between them. So I actually went into the manuscript and dotted a few little pieces of me translating the sounds that the chicken was making and what I believed she was saying to my son to comfort my son. And it was a pretty daring thing to do for a memoir. I sent it off to my editor, and within an hour, she called back and said, bingo, you hit it.
Nice. Yeah. And I do think that was one of the things that I really liked, that you were interpreting her clucks and ticks and all the different sounds she made. I could tell that the way this is written, you're guessing at what she said, but you do it in a way that feels real and natural, because I listen to birds outside. I walk every single morning, first thing. So you hear all of the birds and you can tell when they're pissed off at each other, when they're having the little battle, when they're happy. And one time even, and this broke my heart, there were all of these different songbirds in this forested area that I walked past, and a crow flew out. You knew that the crow had gotten one of the babies because the sound of mourning was so powerful. So I think you're tapping into these things that are already there. I mean, we don't all speak chicken, but if you listen closely, you will begin to hear the language in all of the things that are happening around you. And to me, as a reader, that enriched your story because it helped me know Andrew, your son, in a new way, and to see the different ways that we do communicate and the different ways that language happens. And that was important to me because I used to work with children who have autism. The first person with autism that I worked with, I think I was 16 years old. So I've had experiences with people who have autism for a very long time, and they do communicate in different ways. And I think one of the misperceptions that people have, and you're going to know more about this than I do because your son is autistic, is that people will often misinterpret those with autism as not having feelings, not being interested in things, not understanding what's going on because they communicate differently. But the
Yes,
reality is, you just don't know their language.
exactly. And that's what I was exploring, and that I realized I have been doing my whole life with my son, is trying to step into his world and understand his language.
Yeah.
And his language is beautiful. It's
Hmm.
really incredible. And he has very deep feelings. He'll be sitting eating dinner and we're having spaghetti, and he'll have this profound thought, just one sentence that he says. And it's very apparent to my husband and I that he's been thinking about this, and he has
Hmm.
this opinion, or and he has this gut feeling, this sensory feeling of the
Yes.
world around him that is much more sophisticated than most people, more sophisticated than me at times. You're right. There's this inherent beauty in people who experience life in a different way than we do.
Yes.
And not just autism, there's all sorts of varying abilities and ability levels of people that have intuition, or people who experience emotions on a different plane than we might expect them to. And being able to have the ears to listen and the heart open to step into that with them is something I'm most grateful for as a gift from my son, is
Yeah.
teaching me that.
I think we're just beginning to crack into what neurodiversity is and how it impacts who we are, how we communicate, how we see the world, how the world impacts us. And I think your book helps us look at those things so that we can begin to say, how does the world influence me? How does it impact me? How do I communicate in a way that's perhaps like what people experience or what they expect of me? And how am I communicating in a different way? Or how could I communicate in a different way? And I love that about it. So there's so much about the disability story in here and about understanding your son. And I'm going to ask you a question about portraying someone who has a disability when you are not that person. I'm going to go there first. But then one of the things I want to talk about is being a parent of someone with a disability, because I worked with children who have disabilities, and my aunt also, her one daughter has multiple disabilities. And there's a certain kind of experience that parents have. Yours is obviously one unique experience, and everyone's experience is unique, but there are also some commonalities. So we're going to go down that rabbit hole for a second and how that relates to your book. First, let's talk about Andrew. He's an autistic person. How did you go about writing him in a way that was respectful to his experience, but also not sharing too much of his story because this is your story?
That is an excellent question. I think it was a process. When I very first started, and one of the first questions you asked me is, how did this book come about? And
Yeah.
I had a great piece of advice from a friend, and she said, be messy and write as if no other eyes will ever see it. I was very
Nice.
hung up in all of these emotions that I had, and all of these feelings and judgments. There was a
Yeah.
lot of frustration. We spent well over a decade mostly in the hospital, in,
Hmm.
out of the hospital, doctor's appointments, every other day of the week for years, trying to figure out what was going on. And it's very easy to become jaded or frustrated, to become angry, to feel like you're not being heard when you're telling the
Hmm.
doctor something is wrong. When I was writing, at first, I had no intention that anybody else would see it, or it would be published. It was just releasing all of this stuff onto the page. And the thing that was so good about that for me is it allowed me to really get angry, to be
Yeah.
upset, to feel betrayed. There were friends that we had had for a long time, and it was just too difficult for them at some point to walk along this journey. It was a
Yeah.
lot to hold. And the sadness and the grief with that, a friendship
Hmm.
changing or pulling away. I gave myself permission to have all those ugly emotions on the page. And then I printed everything out, went to Kinko's, bound it, and chucked it in my closet.
Love
And
it.
it sat there for about 6 months, and I let it stew. I let it do its thing. And it really was like one morning I woke up and I thought, okay, I'm ready to look at that. And as I read it, I could see it was the Kristin from 6 months ago experiencing that. I could see the growth. And I'd also done my own work in being able to forgive, let go, and not pass judgment. And so when I addressed it a second time, I was able to take this story as I had written it and then try to sit, close my eyes, and be in that friend's seat, sitting inside of them, or in my family members, or in my husband or my daughter who was acting out because she was upset and traumatized.
Sure.
What did it feel like to be her? And when I could have a deep compassion or understanding of them, I was able to go back and write and rewrite and refine and write about the things that happened from my perspective, but also having an understanding of how others were trying to deal with a situation as well. And really with compassion and respect, a reader definitely gets, oh, she's really frustrated with this doctor, but I really worked hard not to pass judgment and say, oh, he was a jerk, he didn't listen to me. So I really just tried to show this is what happened in the scene from my perspective, and then let a reader decide, oh, I think Kristin was feeling this way, or this doctor was trying his best, but he had no idea.
Yeah. Well, your son had some really complicated medical issues that were difficult to diagnose. But what I like about your approach is that you were able to see your own experience and feel all of the feelings that you were perhaps stuffing down or could not feel because you were trying to survive. And anytime we're trying to survive an experience, we cannot survive and feel at the same time for the most part, especially when you're dealing with life or death and the stakes are really high. The way we survive is we shut those things down so that we can keep other parts of our brain online. So you did that work. Then it sounds like you worked with a therapist so that you could process and make some sense around what it was that happened to you. And after you'd done that and you had shown tremendous compassion to yourself, then and only then were you able to do that perspective taking where you were able to look at, okay, what were they thinking? What's the other angle to the same story? And when we do that, we create rich and rounded characters that we can believe in because we know this isn't a vendetta.
Yes.
And as a person who's been on some medical journeys, I can understand the vendetta mindset.
Oh, yes, it still creeps in every once in a while, but I'm able to recognize it and understand when I'm passing judgment on something that I haven't stepped in and looked at from the other way.
Yeah. And I think the fine line of that, and I'll be curious to hear what you say, is a fine line between going like, oh, wow, there's all my judgy stuff and here's all my crap coming out because we all have it. And saying like, wow, I wonder what else is there. What do I need? What's missing for me? And then why is it I can't look at this from someone else's perspective versus going like, wow, I'm really angry and anger isn't an emotion that I'm comfortable with. And oh, wow, that's not very nice. If you're listening, I have my air quotes out nice. And so I'm going to look at it from someone else's perspective and discount my own.
Absolutely. That is a process that I have had to work on personally to recognize that.
You and me both. When I worked with children and their parents, when I worked in elementary school in particular, so I worked in middle school and elementary school. And when you're working in special education, this is the time when children get diagnoses. Many children come into the special education system early on, maybe in kindergarten, first grade. A problem is picked up. They're behind in some areas. And so they get some additional services with the hopes that they're going to catch up. Other children come into the system and it's clear right away that either they've been diagnosed with a disability early on because they have a developmental disability, which is usually something they're born with, or there's a strong concern that there's a disability. But the process of getting an educational diagnosis and a medical diagnosis is often a process. When that diagnosis comes about, it's this fulcrum moment for so many people because, on the one hand, this concern has been there the whole time. There's worry, worry, worry. Gosh, I just want to have an answer. And then the other hand, when the answer is yes, your child has a disability, there is profound grief because the dream of the child you had before dies so that you can have the dreams of the child that you have. And it's not that one dream is better than the other, it is a different dream, though. And there is tremendous grief.
There is a lot of grief in that. And I often work with families right at that pivotal time
Hmm.
when they are getting the diagnosis, and all of these emotions erupt and come out. And
Hmm.
what often happens is they want to go in and be really upset at the school or the teacher, or they're not doing it.
Sure.
And they sit in these IEP meetings and they're quite traumatized. People are talking about all of these things that your son or your daughter is going to need, and
Hmm.
it's very frightening. And so what happens a lot of times is parents will get in a head to head with the administration or the
Hmm.
teachers or the special education teachers. I try to coax them, even though their emotions are right underneath the surface, to come in with a conciliatory approach, saying, okay, it looks like this is what we're dealing with. We're trying to process it. What can we do to help support you as educators to make this the best opportunity for our son or daughter? Even just coming in with that little bit of a shift, instead of, I want to make sure I get all of these things that I deserve.
Mm.
I'm supposed to get this much speech or OT or this or that. Parents are just desperately wanting to connect their kids with every possible service they can.
Yeah.
Coming in with that little bit of a pivot makes a tremendous difference and sets the tone for them being able to advocate for their child throughout the school system. It's a very difficult time. Nobody wants a label put on their kid.
Of
I
course.
I avoided it. I was terrified of it, and I avoided it until Andrew was in kindergarten. They said, we can't help him unless we have a code to write down. We need
Yeah.
a label. In the back of my head, I knew that label, but I wasn't ready to accept it.
Yeah.
At the time when Andrew was diagnosed, which is the early 90s, autism was not a household word. It was associated with the movie Rain Man.
Hmm.
That was the only type of understanding a lot of the educators had. His first grade teacher, who I loved, was wonderful. But when she greeted him, she said, "Hi, Andrew. Oh, I know you. You're like Rain Man." And it was crushing for the mama. No, my son is not Rain Man. My son is Andrew. At the time, she had no other frame of reference. That they didn't even have the support systems or the training that they have today for the parents stepping into that paradigm.
Yes.
So yes, I mean, I understand exactly what you were sharing, your experience in the teaching area, because it's a very hard time for parents.
It is. And what I would say is that it doesn't, at least on the outside, in the conversations I've had with different people, the grief piece isn't something that happens once. It's always great when everybody can come to the table with a sense of curiosity and how can we make this work? Because that lessens the fear and that desire to control. But at the same time, there's always going to be these developmental milestones or these intersection points where things are different and
Yes.
that grief comes up. In this story, we see some of that grief, but this is a layered story because not only does Andrew have autism, he's autistic, but also he's a child that is medically fragile, who has a very serious medical issue going on that swallows up everything. And so it could have been easy to just write the story of how we were swallowed up. When parents have children with disabilities, that can become their identity. You know, I'm the mom of Andrew, the mom of an autistic child, and that's all they are. But you were able to round this story out by really looking at and wrestling with what was going on underneath the surface for you. How did you balance the enormity of this medical journey that had me going like, OMG, what's going to happen? And I want to get to that last page to figure out, does he survive or not? Dealing with the internal transformation that needs to happen in memoir.
Another great piece of advice that was given to me when I was finding this new tribe of people, when things started to get really hard and confusing, there was this shifting in our life of people around us, community and tribe. After they left, it did leave room for something new to come in. I had this wonderful group of women who were completely open to hear my ranting, my fears and my trauma and everything. And they would sit there. But one of the gals said to me, but where was that tiny glimmer of light? I told this story that felt dark, like I was in this cave and I could never get out. But she said, look around, find the little glimmer of light. And so I've used that throughout the book. Here is what happened. Here is the scariness of what happened and how I felt. But where was the little piece of light that came in? One of the parts of the book, I talk about Andrew had been in the hospital for months and months and months, and Christmas was coming. And that makes things topsy-turvy, the holidays. And we were not participating in anything because we were living at the hospital with him as a minor. My husband came in and my mother-in-law brought strings of Christmas lights and we taped them up all over the room. We wrapped the doors like big Christmas presents and everything. My husband and I were laying on this tiny hospital cot on Christmas Eve night, and you could hear out in the hallway jingle bells, and you could hear ho, ho, ho. And there was a Santa and elves pulling one of those big roller bins that they use at the hospital with all the implements on it, but stacked with presents. And they knocked on the door and came in. And my son was not, I mean, he was in so much pain and on so much meds at the time that he didn't even wake up. But my husband and I had that wonderful childhood-like feeling of Santa coming and bringing us gifts. They left gifts with us and visited with us and went down the hall to the next kids. That little tiny glimmer of light in a months and months long of darkness just filled us up. I still practice that same thing in my life every day. Where did I find those pinpoints of light? Not just, you know, it's very popular now, and I think it's a wonderful thing, is writing gratitude journals and writing a list of gratitudes every day. But I like to switch it up a little and just say, where was that tiny point of light in this situation? And that created a mind shift in me and in my writing, to bring humor in, to recognize humor when I saw it in the middle of something that was dark, and to be able to laugh at it. That took practice.
There are a lot of different ways that we have to train our brains to see our stories expansively. And I love that. What is the pinprick of light? And you do have some absolutely hilarious moments in this book. And there's also a stuffed frightful that appears, which is lovely. But I think one of the other things you do well that can create this pinpoint of light for the reader are these thoughtful, poignant moments. So there's this moment in the book where someone else is asking you, do you know the difference between resigning and relinquishing? And for me, as the reader, I had to pause and say, do I know the difference? If you're listening and you're like, well, I don't know how to create light in the darkness, things like that can help. Just creating a little question that challenges the reader as well as your character can help bring a sense of lightness because we begin to see the story more expansively.
Yes. How I understand the difference between resigning or relinquishing. Resigning feels to me like giving up, like, okay,
Mhm.
everything is turned to crap. I just give up, throwing your hands up. But relinquishing is a choice and a handing over
Yes.
or letting go. At many points during the book, I had to relinquish and hand over
Mhm.
my control and fear of wanting to keep my son alive. I had
Yeah.
to hand it over to what felt like a higher power.
Mhm.
There was a big internal wrestling throughout the book on, is there anything more than this? If this feels so difficult and so upsetting and so much misery, there has to be something more or something
Mhm.
bigger than this that maybe I can't see. And that relinquishing was when I was finally ready to say, okay, I hand this over. I accept the things, I hand this over. And I waited. I had to be still and listen for that internal voice in me
Mhm.
that assured me that all was well. It always will be, and it always has been. And that was a mantra that I carried with me throughout
Mhm.
the whole process.
That is so beautiful. I love that you were able to do that work in the midst of this hard situation, which you have written about so beautifully. I hope everyone goes and gets your book because it is truly amazing. I'm going to end with my 3 lightning round questions because we could be here all day. There's so many other things we could talk about, but alas, we have to move on with the day. So, you've shared some really brilliant writing wisdom. Is there any last piece of writing advice that you'd like to share?
My best writing advice would be to really write from that vulnerable, deep gut place and write your very first writing, your very first draft from that place with that deep emotion
Mhm.
and be honest, vulnerable, and an absolute truth teller on the page. Then you can step away from it. When you come back, you can do the self editing and shape it. If you're willing to put a pen to paper, set a timer. Don't lift the pen, even if it's just 5 minutes.
Mhm.
Just write and get it all out because I guarantee that even in a 5 minute point of time, I will pluck out little gold nuggets that I can take and place elsewhere.
Absolutely. So, what I'm hearing is don't self edit.
Yes.
Write it for yourself first. That is the most
Yes.
important thing. You went through a really big, challenging experience. And one of the things I do love about your book is you have these survival guide tips, which I would imagine you also used in writing this book. If you have one survival guide tip, what would that be?
Leaning into your tribe or your community. It
Mm,
can be one person, it can be the 3 a.m. person, the one person that you know at 3 a.m. when everything's falling apart, you can call and they will listen and take it in and just hold it, hold
yeah.
the story. They don't have to be somebody who fixes it at all, but one person that you trust to hold your story, not only in my outward life, but in my inward life and my writing life. That's just a really important thing to have.
Yes. Very important. So build your community. My hope is that your appearance on this podcast helps to build your community as more people connect with you and your book. And so, if people want to do that and they want to get a copy of The Chicken Who Saved Us, which once again, I'm going to hold up, look at this beautiful picture of Andrew and Frightful. What are the best ways for people to connect with you?
Through my website, it's KristinJarvisAdams.com. And there's a place that you can email me. I'm very good at email and will answer you back right away. I'm also on Instagram at Kristin Jarvis Adams. You can get the book on Amazon, also at Barnes & Noble, indie bookstores, wherever books are sold.
And I will say, if you love the book, do review it because that helps every author. So
wonderful. Thank you.
And also I will tell you, if you missed any of those things that Kristin said, they will all be in the show notes. So every way to contact her will be there. Kristin, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I'm truly honored. It was a delight to read your book. And I have thought about you and Andrew and Frightful many times since I finished it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
That's it for today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about Kristin Jarvis Adams, or more importantly, buy a copy of The Chicken Who Saved Us, please see the show notes for this episode. If you're learning from or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's a free and easy way to support the podcast. You can also get the latest episodes delivered to your inbox by signing up for my Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of A Trauma Survivor's Guide to Writing the Tough Stuff. You can also follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, where you can leave a 5-star review. If you have questions for me, comments about the podcast, or questions or topics you'd like me to consider for the Writing Your Resilience podcast, please leave a comment on YouTube. I read them all, and I'd love to hear from you.